Hey everyone, great to be here. I want to talk today about priorities for green public goods builders in 2022. So this talk is a bridge between the public goods funding community in the Web3 space and the Sustainable Blockchain Summit, Filecoin Green, and related projects. So the goal of this talk is to kind of tell you about some of the work that we're doing in the public goods building community, and then think of relevant applications and so on. And in a big way, that whole community is inspired by all the kind of really critical funding work that the green world pioneered with things like carbon credits. So a carbon credit is a great example of an impact certificate, and impact certificates are the kinds of things that the public goods building community is studying. So this talk is based on the public goods builders' priorities that I presented at Funding Commons recently, but this is tuned for this community and tuned for green tech. I want to go through a few points. So first off, why this century really matters. It should be obvious to everyone in this summit, but let's talk about it anyway. Also, why crypto econ specifically is key for solving planetary scale problems. Then I want to kind of talk about how we're exploring regenerative mechanisms and systems in the public goods building community. And then I want to talk a bit about mechanisms and experiments to try. So we're going to flip the order a little bit. And then I want to leave with some goals for the next year and some advice for builders out there. So humanity has seen this amazing range of improvements over the last few centuries. It's been a tremendous success story on every single measure of human well-being that we can think of. Or I don't know if every single one that we can think of, but most of the ones that large communities and governments and so on tend to track, we are doing dramatically better on. So we've been able to lift hundreds of millions to billions of people out of poverty. We've been able to give reliable access to food and shelter and water to billions of people. We've been able to build very fast-paced R&D pipelines that help us understand the world and the universe better and let us build technologies that solve massive scale problems. So think of like the great successes of sanitation and being able to understand biology and then genetics and so on. So it's just been kind of this tremendously optimistic view for the last few centuries. It's very difficult to zoom out and look at just how good of a story it really is. But it's important to do so every once in a while. However, there are some key problems that these improvements don't quite capture. So in particular, we're reaching as a species a level where we can extinct ourselves and every other species on this planet. And there's a bunch of different kinds of risks that we can be exposed to just in terms of nature and how nature works. It's unideal that based on like many groups' articulation and so on, the risks that we pose to ourselves are dramatically higher than the risks that nature poses for us. So it's not that the universe is an inhospitable place, it's that if we're not careful, we will become inhospitable to ourselves. So this is also happening in this. So by the way, in this century, these X risks we're gonna have to make it through this gauntlet of having to figure out how to survive these particular existential risks. In the meantime, we're also part of this like massive transition with life itself becoming digital, which is like a whole other thing. And to make matters a little bit trickier, the kind of operating system of the species, the macro systems that we rely on, are kind of inadequate to solve these kinds of problems. These systems were built up and kind of pioneered in the 1700s when they replaced a series of inadequate systems at the time, and they've seen a bunch of really good upgrades along the way. But fundamentally, there's some inefficiencies here where we're just at a point where they can be captured too easily, they can be co-opted, they can get misaligned from human well-being. And so it's this point where we need different kinds of structures that can improve the whole structure. And this is where cryptocon can really help. But it has to start, we have to, before we can remotely claim to do something better than any credible nation state, we have to be able to prove that we can scale what we're doing to be able to handle economies and resource allocation and success at the scale of a modern nation state. And so a grand challenge for the crypto community is to prove that we can do that, to prove that these systems can do resource allocation and goal setting and improvement towards those goals better than these other systems, or they can come and enhance those existing systems and improve them. So hopefully I've convinced you that this is a century that really matters. Now, this particular decade is also extremely interesting because, first off, we're going to see massively powerful ML and AI improvements landing, all the way to the most optimistic AGI predictions are kind of late in this decade. The bulk of the expert distribution is the decade after. But kind of on the way there, we're going to see tremendous improvements coming from ML systems that can be applied to all kinds of problems that we thought were intractable before. So just keep abreast of what's happening in ML, because every quarter, something tremendous might have happened that can solve some major problem that you thought was intractable. And so we're now entering that era where that kind of problem solving can happen. Separately, Web3 and crypto, which sort of have been building and growing for a while, are not in this decade will reach a level of scale to be actually handle web scale level traffic, and then can become mainstream through that. The thing really preventing crypto and Web3 to become mainstream is that you can't really build consumer applications that are entirely Web3 based, and so that bottleneck will basically get figured out in the next 3 to 5 years. In this decade, we'll also see climate change effects being dramatically more self-evident. Everyone here in Paris is probably feeling a bunch of the heat. This will get worse and worse and worse throughout this decade. And the good news here is a decade is a long time. So quarters and years feel really short. It's kind of difficult to think about having massive impact in that time frame, but a decade is enough time. So think of the entire Web3 and crypto space as being a little bit over a decade old. In fact, the first few years was very tiny. It wasn't even growing as fast as new projects are today. So really 10 years is a long time. You can achieve massive scale impact in the world. So you should be very optimistic about the things that we're making. Now, this particular year is also critical because it's a moment in time when we're hitting this inflection point where now there's tens of thousands of scientists and builders and entrepreneurs and artists and just people around the world coming into Web3 and crypto to play around with the primitives, to try building things, and to try and use these kind of magical superpowers. So it's a very good experimental era. Lots of new things are getting built. There's tons of low-hanging fruit, many new projects, and so on. We also are in a period of time where the crypto space is on the order of $1 to 3 trillion US dollars in range, depending on when you look at it, right? So, but this means it's a very good experiment size. Much smaller than that, it's very difficult to argue that these economies are significant enough to do resource allocation at large scale. Much larger than that, it's very dangerous to start messing with the parameters that can wheel an entire economy in one direction or another. So this is an extremely good experimental scale to build much better systems that can prove that we can do really good resource allocation and so on, and not just resource allocation, but also preference finding, organizing and coordinating large groups towards those goals and so on. In this year, the public goods movement is also growing a lot, and this downturn now is a great building time to kind of cause a super strong refi summer. So if the last crypto summer was the DeFi summer, let's make the next summer the refi summer. So, and this is a great moment to build during this entire period to then come in strong in the next upturn. So crypto econ. Huge thanks to the people building these diagrams and the Green Pill book. By the way, Green Pill book, you should get one. It's really amazing mimetic engineering from Kevin Owake, and who you'll hear from soon, and many other people involved in the Gigacon community. An amazing book to introduce a lot of people into the principles of crypto econ and why this moment is really special and what the tools enable, and it paints a really awesome, optimistic vision of the future. So these are two diagrams from there that kind of put in context what cryptoeconomic systems are and how they compose and so on. So think of blending all of these kinds of different disciplines into a kind of new science and practice of building systems. I'd like to think about it in terms of software eating mechanism design. So think of incentives and mechanisms and game theory and so on finally reaching just all of law and policy space, and then all of financial instruments and contract space and so on. And so this kind of enables a massive scale rewriting of all kinds of structures, whether small scale structures in how small groups coordinate, or how large groups coordinate, or how large groups coordinate with other large groups, or how entire nation states might coordinate. So this is basically a different substrate in which you can write the operating system of communities. And so today we've been using just kind of like natural language laws and trying to propagate those through kind of this medium that doesn't give you like automatic verification or automatic execution. We've now built this amazing software platform in the world that we've deployed worldwide. We gave a lot of people, hopefully everyone, these supercomputers that allow them to access all this kind of magical software power. And now we can create mechanism design on top of that to be able to coordinate us towards very good outcomes. Just to give you a glimpse of the power of crypto-econ, the entire Bitcoin hash rate, which is one of the largest energy consumers on the planet, like largest single energy consumers on the planet, rivaling nation states, and the topic of much discussion in the world, is entirely yielded by a single mechanism. The block reward coupled to the price of Bitcoin is an impact evaluator that causes this massive scale dedication of energy to this process. And it's a runoff process. It's just going to keep maximizing the hash rate provided to Bitcoin over time. So this gives you a sense of just how powerful these primitives are if you build them and they're scalable and so on. So this tells us two things. One, we should fix this impact evaluator so that it's doing something like really good for the planet, not something bad. Like there's a bunch of like energy waste that's happening out of this. And if we can, as like the panel before was discussing, clean all of this up, then this will go from like a negative impact evaluator to a positive impact evaluator, and that would be pretty great. So like greenifying Bitcoin. So let's take all what we've learned from Filecoin Green and make Bitcoin green or something like that. And really getting to a point where all of Bitcoin is now green, it would be a phenomenal outcome. The second thing is just shows you just how powerful these tools are. So if you think very carefully and clearly about these impact evaluators, if you deploy them into the world, if they're scalable, you can move mountains with these kinds of things. We've gotten a feel for it in the Filecoin world. We use a similar impact evaluator. In our case, it's about incentivizing the storage capacity in the network, and now the storage use in the network. The way in which the block reward in Filecoin works is an example of tuning the impact evaluator in Bitcoin to then start accounting for something valuable of where you can reuse that power, meaning storage capacity and so on, that you can then store data in, and then how to tune that impact evaluator as well to start prioritizing certain kinds of work over others. So the impact evaluator of the block reward in Filecoin is tuned by a thing called the Filecoin Plus program that orients the effect of the impact evaluator towards really valuable contributions in the form of storing really valuable data for the network. And so that tuning just takes an extremely powerful impact evaluator and aims it at the actual KPIs that we want to optimize in the network. So we don't just want to get a ton of capacity in the network. We want to get a ton of like really valuable usage of the network. And you can do that with those kinds of impact evaluators. And that just required some tweaking into the actual structure. So hopefully I've like convinced you that crypto-econ can be tremendously powerful, and it shows a lot of promise. We can use this kind of mechanism design to achieve pareidotopia. Pareidotopia is like this concept that comes from game theory, where you can think through the kind of like preference sets of many different people, organizations, actors, whatever, and you can, instead of kind of thinking just about kind of zero-sum games and getting from that to a positive-sum game, you can go into kind of Pareto-efficient cooperation and voluntary cooperation, and then realize that in reality, when groups cooperate and you can get to leverage science, technology, and that kind of build-out, you can not just grow the pie, but you can grow the pie by many orders of magnitude. So like defection and like conflict and so on, it's just like doesn't make any sense. Like it's just very obvious from looking through all of this kind of game theory that it does not make sense to be in conflict in the long term. And so if we can create mechanisms and create tooling that can orient all of us towards this kind of highly collaborative, voluntary cooperation area of the space, we could be improving our condition dramatically year over year and so on. And in a big way, like we've been doing a version of this for the last few centuries, and in kind of like booms and busts in the millennia before. It's been a pretty good time in the last few centuries, but we need to very much crank it up because we're now reaching the point where the tooling that we're building is like extremely powerful. So we're starting to put into place the use of this tooling to build much better systems. So we can think of like the goal of building a green cloud. You heard from Alan earlier today about how the Filecoin Green project is doing this, how we're making Filecoin itself verifiably sustainable and trying to greenify the whole thing. And the goal is not to just get to decarbonize Filecoin and get it to be neutral, but instead to be climate positive, get to the point where it can start actually being an agent of decarbonization on the planet, so that whenever people are running Filecoin, you're actually contributing to the solution of this problem. And hopefully the talks today kind of give you a view into how all of this happens, all the different parts, all the different work that has to go into measuring the work, getting the work to be verifiable, coupling that with good instruments to make this like a good and reliable and credible offsetting, and then how you build that entire system and that loop to make sure that the whole thing actually works, and then how do you take that and scale it to the whole network, and then how you take that and then scale it to as an example for many other networks that we can then kind of boost up. So yeah, it's been pretty awesome to see the impact here. Like Filecoin Green is a relatively new project. I think like about a year old, maybe a little bit more. And it's been like just this tremendous, maybe it's 2 years, but it has this tremendous level of impact in a very short time, getting to build one of the greenest cloud platforms on the planet, and so it's really, really cool. Another thing that's coming out of this community, which is really exciting, is the ability to couple these movements with a kind of builder pipeline towards assisting groups that are trying to build these things to connect with each other, access capital, access distribution, access users, and so on. And so a kind of recommendation for the community would be to like instrument that builder funnel to help everybody that wants to try and work on these things, and especially kind of connecting talent as well. So if people really care about these problems, coming to this community and trying to find a project to work on, if we can kind of instrument that and do really well, we can give a huge boost to all of the projects in these communities. So just think about like the people, the organizations, the attempts at building a thing, at all of these efforts, even though they're small, they're like valuable. They're like the seeds and saplings that we have to like help nurture to get somewhere. So other things that are key that we can use CryptoEcon for is accelerating science and technology improvement itself. So we can think about modeling the R&D pipeline, think about how we do more research, how we turn that research into technologies, how we turn those technologies into products, how the kind of value creation and value capture works across that pipeline, to then create funnels of funding and reward coming back from markets all the way to funding the whole pipeline. It's my view that one of the biggest problems that we've had for the last 50 plus years is that there's a missing coordination system in between science and technology and product building that creates like a lack of incentives in the middle of this innovation chasm, where tons of good ideas just go to die and get stuck there because there's no reliable large-scale incentive to push these things along. You need incentives at the scale of trillions, not hundreds of billions. And it's kind of like this weird case where like that kind of scale matters. Great. Let's go into some regenerative mechanisms and systems. The public goods funding community has been around in the crypto space for a while, but it has been really kicking into gear in the last few years, notably in great part thanks to the Gatecoin community, the Green Pill movement, Shelling Point, Funding the Commons, and many other groups that are Optimism, and a ton of DAOs that are starting to look into these kinds of things. And all of it comes from the shared realization that blockchains and smart contracts operate at massive scale. We have this enormous potential to solve deep coordination problems at both small scales, medium scales, and really massive scales. And that it's kind of on us to organize a movement to build new models for sustainable public goods funding and value alignment in these kinds of networks. One that is very near and dear to me that I think has an enormous potential is if we can find a reliable way to couple funding flows to open source tool development, like that could just kind of very quickly scale up massive amount of production of public goods. It just tends to be a very tricky and nasty problem to get right. But if we can like crack that one, like that would be just one of these tremendously high leverage things to work on. The movement is growing. There's a lot of communities working together and building tools and building systems and exploring a bunch of this landscape together. So this is a moment of exploration where people are trying out new things, coming up with new ideas, proposing new things, trying them at different scales, learning from them, instrumenting them, and trying to kind of report on successes and so on. This is a highly experimental area where we should be trying experiments at various scales. We should be learning from them and then figuring out what are the kinds of things that are going to scale and work well. I'm going to mention a few things from Funding the Commons because it's one of the areas that I'm looking most closely, and this talk is kind of coming from that community. There's a lot of different kinds of mechanisms that you can use to fund things. There are things like Game Pass certificates, which again are based on things like carbon credits. There are new kind of entities that you can create in the world. Like you don't have to limit yourself to traditional corporations or traditional NGOs or nonprofits and so on. But now with all of the DAO tooling and all of the blockchain organization tooling, you can create programmable organizations. So you can tune the way in which these organizations work and put it into code that executes. You don't have to hope that the current different like lower level legal infrastructure that you're using is going to respect the goal set of the group. You can embed the goals of the group directly into the system, and that's a super powerful tool. My sense is that there's probably a lot of value in coordination systems that cross organizations. Coordination systems both for single organizations and across organizational boundaries. So think of like a network equivalent of OKRs or things like that, or creating things like the climate map and building like long-term tech trees for different groups to work on different parts. This kind of coordination tooling is like fairly difficult. Alan this morning was talking about like the theory of the firm and so on. Most of the coordination tooling that we have is inside of firms, and we have some coordination tooling outside, but it's very sparse relative to the internal coordination tooling. So we can focus on building coordination tooling for networks, for open networks of different organizations. That could let us do really, really well. An example of this kind of thing working with great effect is GitHub. GitHub enabled coordination on projects across organizational boundaries, and it had massive impact in the last 20 years. We're building through things like Funding the Commons and Shelling Point and many other groups, and the Green Pill podcast and more. We're building this amazing repertoire of content that explores all of these different ideas. So highly recommend everyone in this event and hearing this talk to explore the landscape of what's happening. And we should get these things transcribed and searchable and so on. The space is moving really quickly, and we're experimenting with a lot of things. So I encourage you to connect with other groups, reach out to folks. If you find a really interesting project, reach out to those speakers, reach out to the people involved, and work on it. Great. So I'm going to talk a little bit about some mechanisms to try for a moment. So I think that this community could experiment with cleaning up carbon credits. So this means look at the existing carbon credit systems, figure out problems, and instead of saying, oh, this thing is broken, let's not use it, let's make a completely new thing, think about how to improve those systems, because they've been installed into extremely difficult systems to change. And if you can just kind of sprinkle some verifiability onto the whole thing, or sprinkle other improvements, that could be extremely high leverage. So think of like the colored coins approach. The colored coins approach was a way of taking Bitcoin and trying to enhance Bitcoin with programmability. Think of creating like greener carbon credits. So groups can start transacting on carbon credits that are like enhanced with some verifiability layers. Think of it kind of like the REC strategy, right? The REC strategy is extremely good to be able to take a fungible, hard to distinguish resource and make it and pick a subset of that resource and be able to transact in that subset, even though you're using the underlying transactional layer that doesn't give you that information, right? So you can kind of like wrap existing models, add some information on the top, and transact at a higher layer and make that work. So you can totally take existing carbon credit systems and improve it in this way, and I think that could be extremely high leverage. We should also look more at this kind of REC structure. That kind of model is extremely powerful. Are there other problems that we can solve that way, where there's just some fundamental difficulty because information is getting lost somewhere, can you take the strategy of creating other certificates, publishing those certificates, and enabling new transactions to happen on top of some other transactional substrate without having to hope that everyone switches over to a new grid? We should look at impact evaluators. Impact evaluators are these structures where you can measure some KPI, and you can associate some funding source to the improvement of that KPI, and you can reward participants that are contributing to that KPI. So think of the Bitcoin block reward and the Filecoin block reward as KPIs, as impact evaluators that are rewarding some function that the system and the network are operating in. You can use this kind of tooling to incentivize all kinds of other systems, all kinds of other KPIs and so on. Now be careful, if you get the wrong KPI, or you go too far without a check or something, then you might get the Bitcoin problem where suddenly you have this run of impact evaluator that's just kind of consuming all the energy in its path. So in those cases, build escape hatches, build ways of improving it, build ways of shutting them off, and so on, or kind of upgrading them into the preference set of the community that is building these things. I think it's possible to create a planetary stability IE network. I'm going to talk about that in a moment. I'm running out of time, so I'm going to, if there's time, I'll return to this. I think we can also use the funding structures and the funding programs that we're building across the public funding community to support all of the green tech and all the sustainable blockchain world. So leverage Gitcoin and other grant programs to scale public goods funding, try other funding allocation protocols in terms of try different mechanisms for allocating. Think of ways of coupling success in a project to then downstream allocation into new projects as well. So create structures where you get this whole regenerative loop working. Impact evaluators, I'll just mention briefly, is this tool to be able to enable a community of agents that want to achieve an objective, to frame that in terms of a measure you're gonna track, a pool of funds that you're gonna use to incentivize, and a kind of measurement set that you're gonna couple to the impact that you're trying to see. You can think of it as kind of a control theory loop from the traditional mechanisms, physical mechanisms world, planes run on these kinds of control theory loops. All kinds of systems around the world behave this way. Think of using that exact structure, but now couple it in incentive design and incentive mechanisms and so on. You can also potentially model impact evaluators as a valve on cash flows, where you have some cash flow, and you're trying to redirect that cash flow according to success against a KPI. So the traditional model of Bitcoin with a huge reserve that kind of gets whittled down over time is one version. You can think of that reserve being funded by the success in the KPI. So you can create a regenerative loop where, as you're funding impact on a KPI, you're generating some value, and you can pipe that back into the impact evaluator itself. You can get an even stronger reinforcement loop in place. Sort of what an impact evaluator does is it slices up time, and it lets you kind of measure impact in a time slice, attribute that impact, and assign the credit to some participants. So you measure the world, you evaluate and assign the credit, and then you reward those participants. It's an extremely powerful tool. Part of the power comes from the just kind of public commitment of this coordination tool existing without having to write an email, ask anybody for something or whatever. The mechanism is there in the sky, it works, and groups and communities can plan against that in large scale. So think of the entire Bitcoin community as an example of planning for over a decade based on that impact evaluator. You have massive scale corporations that are able to reliably bet and forecast their future just based on this one single impact evaluator. These kinds of tools are extremely powerful. If we can use them to solve other problems, I think we could. I think we can use them to solve other problems. Let's experiment a lot more with them. I also think you can couple these in networks, so you can have impact evaluators that are trying to incentivize different KPIs, and then you can kind of fund those if together they're achieving some success. So this is where you can start building checks and balances, where you can have some set of KPIs maximizing a set of things that you care about, but you really want to maximize the set together and not just a single one. And this is a way where you can start coupling these things together. You can make them positive sum by making them super linear, potentially Pareto preferred, if you can build some kind of memory model into them. So I think you can use these things to solve the problem that Alan was talking about this morning, where if you look at the planetary stability and the planetary boundaries framework, can you create IEs that kind of push against that and reward at massive scale, and build this kind of network of IEs that kind of help build a kind of homeostatic behavior in the economy. They build a structure in the economy that is able to tune the conditions of the planet. Something like this I think might be possible. I claim that this was a huge special decade. I claim this was a really critical year. The Funding the Commons community has kind of these set of goals for the year. I wanted to highlight a few for this community. One is there's going to be a ton of workshops and hackathons that are going to enable communities to build and try new structures. We're trying to create a lot of funding around this, so we're trying to establish different ways of supporting builders and researchers in the space. We want to create these network funds, and we want them to be at a certain scale. We want to scale up impact certificates in other areas. So the proper original impact certificate markets are massive now, so those don't count for this 50 million goal. So we want to scale other kinds of impact certificates. But if you can think of impact certs where ways of coordinating groups or building out the tech for green things, or you come up with some other idea that's not just the carbon credits model or the rights model, definitely come talk to this community. And we want to explore the impact evaluator landscape. Similarly, I think some goals for this community might be to let's keep growing these events. These are fantastically good in terms of connecting people, showcasing project, and tracking progress over time. Let's lean into, so now that we all understand a lot of the problem space, and we need to keep exploring that, of course, let's now turn into more hackathons and build-a-thons to enable more people to try more things and see which of these things might work. We should consider measuring and optimizing this green builder funnel to connect new projects to advice, capital, talent, and everything they need. We should leverage the network funding structures that exist. So we should leverage the Gitcoin network funding, the FTC network, and many other groups in the space. And of course, here's where you can tap into the original public network funding, which is nation states, right? The green world has this advantage over the rest of crypto, where the rest of the world understands this problem, and there's massive scale public funding for solving these problems. There's hundreds of billions of dollars allocated to these things, potentially trillions. So this is an area where if you give nation states a reliable, credible way to solve the problem, nation states will pour in massive scale funding. Let's grow the community. I think in general, we achieve great success by growing our communities. Let's think of incrementally upgrading green impact certificates. So think of coloring carbon credits, think of improving data gathering and certification, verifiability, and so on. Let's build a data science platform around all of these things. And let's kind of build more tools and dashboards. The graphs that I showed at the beginning came from our World in Data website, which is phenomenal in terms of giving the world an accurate measure of KPIs. Let's do that for a bunch of these other problems that we're trying to figure out. Let's experiment with these kinds of impact evaluators. And I think one important thing here is many groups have capital and want to deploy it towards these goals. Let's create an SBS investor network that can couple, that can kind of create a model by which these investors and groups with capital can support people and organizations that are trying to have impact in this world. You may want to experiment with impact capital. This is an area where not just traditional equity fundraising and so on, or token fundraising and so on could help, but an area where impact certificates themselves could be interesting. Lastly, some quick advice. Highly recommend this community to ship quickly. In these public and open networks, value compounds tremendously fast. You can ship some ideas, tell the world about it, and then new projects can appear and scale in a matter of weeks, not years. That's a totally different landscape. Keep the experimental velocity high. Try a bunch of new things. Don't get stuck trying something that's just not working for a long time. I mean, you can keep chipping away at the problem, but find things that are working and follow kind of the path of least resistance. Don't let perfect be the enemy of the good. We have massive problems to solve. You're not going to get everything to kind of be perfect at once. Ship incremental improvements. This is an area where I know a lot of people feel very strongly and negatively about the existing carbon credit market because it was so unverifiable for a long time and it caused massive amounts of damage. But just the idea and the fact that that was a way for nation states to coordinate against a problem, it was phenomenal, and I think it was a huge net positive. Now let's clean them up and improve them and upgrade them to get them to a really, really good state. And one of the things that I've been thinking about recently is like walk-away impact systems. So many systems and programs that people build tend to rely they're very labor-intensive and require a lot of people to constantly invest more time and energy into them to run them. Think of leaning into mechanism design and software to build automated structures where once you kind of like design the thing, you can go and like work on other things, or that community can like go and work on other things if you need to, and maybe the system doesn't keep improving, but at the very least keeps working and it keeps delivering impact. Think of using the best tools available, software, economies, open networks. Don't limit your solution to the problem by not kind of like leveraging like whatever the world has to offer. And with all of this, like really make sure that you're like robustly analyzing the problem space and you're letting other people do that as well. So be open, share what you're doing, share the model, talk about it, hold yourself and others to high standards, but also make allowance for getting there, right? It's okay to like not be perfect from day one. You can like incremental improvement is dramatically more valuable than just forcing everything to be perfect from day one. And the last plug would be to think about composable primitives. Try to build structures that will compose with others so that you can, as you're building something, and build a tool chain for other people to couple and build better solutions that you haven't thought of. Cool. All right, so that's some thoughts and priorities for this community. Thank you so much for having me. Sorry for running a bit over time. Thank you very much.